right, good morning, everybody. Sorry for the late start. Was having problems with going live, but today we're going to be moving into ecological economics. This is going to be a little bit longer than usual, so if you don't hang around and watch the whole thing, I understand. There's been work posted. I posted a couple multiple choice questions and some free response questions in a discussion. So answer those, get those back to me, and I will get those put into the grade book. All right. So ecological economics. I mean, just breaking down the two words, and it'll kind of describe everything that we need to know about it. And I know that most of the class is seniors, but there are juniors in it. So I want to take some time to kind of explain, like, what does it mean by or what are some of the basics of economics? So the outline for this, we're going to talk about economic worldviews. There are quite a few, and we're not going to hit on every single one of them today, but we are going to go through kind of a fair bit. We're going to talk about classic economics, neoclassic economics, and ecological economics. How does the environment play into that? We're going to talk about resources, capital, and reserves. We're going to go through population, technology, and scarcity, natural resource accounting, trade development, and green business, which is kind of a newer field that is starting to develop. I would say it's coming coming out, or it's an emerging business, but it's been around for a bit, and it's I think it's kind of starting to hit its stride recently. And I'll talk about why. Economic worldviews. So economy is the management of resources to meet the needs in the most efficient manner possible. The central theme to this is sustainability, which is using assets in a way that'll make them last. All right. So if I give you $100 and I say this is your $100 and it has to last you, let's say a month. All right. I say it has to last you a month. You could just go out and buy dumb stuff with it on day one, and then you don't have it to last the rest of the month. Or you could kind of budget it and have it last you all the way up to the end of the month, where then you'll get resupplied on it. So that is kind of the core of sustainability, is that rather than just using everything right away for, short-term gain, you are kind of getting into this or thinking more long-term about it. So classical economics, originally a branch of moral philosophy concerned with how individual interests and values intersect with larger scale goals. So that is a ridiculous sentence in order to basically say, how can we invest our time, interest, all of that stuff in order to better everything else? So Adam Smith is founder of modern Western economics. And he came up with this capital system where market competition between willing sellers and buyers is believed to bring out the greatest efficiency of resource use. What that means is that if you have competition, right? Let's say you produce car tires. Let's say you produce car tires. I'm looking outside at my car right now. You produce car tires. If another company comes along and produces car tires also, what makes you better than them? And so then it brings about this whole thing like, well, if your products are the same, then can you drop the price on yours in order to money? Can you create a better product for the same price? And all of these things are to provide better efficiency of what resources you have, either by selling them at a lower cost or making it better in some way. So into that, David Ricardo further refined relation between supply and demand. So we've all heard of supply and demand. So demand is the amount of a product or service consumers are willing and able to buy at various prices, assuming they are free to express their preferences. Notice that it says willing to buy, and a lot of this does have to do a lot with the willing to buy, like the trends of the time. So I bring into example the Chevy Bolt, that's Bolt with a B, and the Tesla Model 3. You could walk into a dealership right now and buy a Chevy Bolt, or you can get put on a waiting list and maybe in a couple years or a year get a Tesla Model 3. Why is that? If they're close to the same price, close to the same specs, they do almost the same thing, why is it that the Chevy Bolt is not selling, but the Tesla is completely sold out? Well, it has to do with demand. People want the Tesla because it's cool. People don't want the Chevy because it's not cool, even though on paper they are pretty close. And so that's one thing that's kind of brought into this with what consumers are willing to pay for. All right. And then supply is the amount that is being paid for those services or for that product. And supply and demand fluctuates quite a bit. One of the things right now, me being a watch enthusiast, is Rolex makes kind of average watches as far as like high-end watches go. They make pretty average watches. But right now, you cannot walk into a dealership and buy, or into an authorized dealer and buy a steel Rolex. A Rolex Daytona should set you back a little over $10,000. If you want one today, it's going to set you back over $16,000 because the demand is high and the supply of it is very low. So what's going to happen with all the people that are buying it up once demand gets met? Well, that we'll see that in the future. So looking at supply and demand curves, the bluish line being supply and this pink purple line being demand. As demand starts to go down, you start to end up with an increase in supply. And as supply is low, there is a high demand, given that people are willing to purchase that product, right? Given that people are willing to purchase that product. Anyone who's been on any sort of social media website has been inundated with buying face masks, these luxury or stylish face masks. Why? Because right now the demand for them is very, very high and the supply was pretty low. And so what they're trying to do is that everyone's trying to push it toward this market equilibrium point where you have a decent supply and a decent demand for it. Obviously, as the coronavirus starts to taper off a little bit, or as people start to get more face masks, this curve is going to shift one way or the other. So going back to my example with Rolex, the supply is very low, therefore the demand is very high, and that means that the price is very high. So in a free market, supply and demand should come into market equilibrium eventually. So using the face mask as an example, right now prices, I mean, I don't know what prices average for face masks are because I don't have them, but from what I saw this morning looking around, $15, $20, $30 for the higher end one. So $15, I don't know if that's a fair price for it or what, but there is a lot of this there is this kind of supply for it, and as that competition increases, as people are producing more of it, those prices are probably going to fluctuate. So you're going to see a lot of ups and downs at first. So marginal cost is the cost of producing one more unit for a product or service. All right, so if you have 1 million to produce 1,000,001, price elasticity is raising price does not necessarily reduce demand. When I was this is going to surprise a lot of people, but when I was in high school, I was a big Apple user, and the problem with Apple laptops is they're very expensive. And I remember I always said, like, why doesn't Apple lower their prices in order to compete with brands? Like the big competing brand back then was Dell. So why don't they lower their prices in order to compete with Dell? Well, it's because they don't have an unlimited marketing supply, and then Mac at the time had limited use. There was very little software written for it. So that price elasticity was something that they took into account. They knew how much they had to sell their computers for in order to make a decent profit. So looking at neoclassic economics, at the end of the 19th century, the field of economics was kind of divided into camps, and that's political economy, which is concerned with social structure, value systems, and relationships among classes, right? So if we were to name certain areas of Fort Wayne, we all know that those are kind of higher end areas. Same thing when I lived in Virginia Beach. There's higher end areas of the town, and there's even higher end areas of the U.S. Like someone that lives on like Long Island, someone Hamptons, Malibu, Areas like that, those are pretty high end. No one's really saying the same thing about like Clay County, South Dakota. Like that's one of the poorer counties in the U.S. So there are kind of these divides among the economy, and that kind of puts people into certain social groups and value systems and things like that. And you can kind of, looking at a lot of the things that are occurring right now, look at kind of how people around you, how they're kind of put into these social classes based off of where they sit at within society. I mean, age is tough to look at, but looking at someone that's between the ages of like 25 and 50, excuse me, you can kind of see like these different trends that they fall into, and they align certain ways politically based off of worldviews and values and their social structure, where they sit at in the world. And then you have neoclassic economics, which is adapted principles of modern science to economic analysis, where we use kind of graphs and charts and things like that in order to um, predict market trends. When I first got into doing stock exchanges and things like that, there's a stock exchange in New York that has a faster transaction time than the other stock exchange. So as part to make it fair, what they have to do is if you come in, you have to plug your computer into this box, which is filled with miles of fiber optic cables in order to slow down your connection to match the other um, stock exchanges. Elon Musk is putting up Starlink, which is a satellite service where you can send a signal from your receiver or your antenna, which is a pizza box size thing that faces the sky, and it hits a satellite. Those satellites use lasers in order to bounce it to where it's going and then send that signal down to a receiver on the other end and pipe it through the internet. If you watch the video by Real Engineering, he talks about how much time this saves, and it's like 30 milliseconds, 40 milliseconds. It doesn't seem like much, but when in the economic world, this is a big deal because it uses a lot of these modern science principles in order to adapt it for economic analysis. And this is why stock prices change second by second. So it retained emphasis on scarcity, supply and demand, and determining prices and resource allocation. So looking at this flow chart, you can see that you have your goods and services. Like with any flow chart, let's pick a spot to start. Let's start on the left with businesses. So businesses produce goods and services for workers and consumers, which then through factors of production like land, labor, and capital influences businesses in order to produce goods and services. In cycling, most people use tires that are filled with air. There are airless tires. They're kind of made up this like rubber honeycomb matrix, and they're really nice. Why does no one use them? Because no one wants them. Because of that, most businesses are going to continue to produce standards goods and services for cyclists, which are then going to use their factors in order to influence the businesses to produce those things. This is why products go through trends in society, right? It used to be everybody ran tubeless tires, or I'm sorry, everyone ran tubular tires. Then it switched over to clincher tires, which have a tube. And now everyone's kind of trending toward tube. Brakes used to always be rim brakes. Now it's moving over to disc brake. Yes, there are still holdouts, but the market mostly is moving toward disc brake. So these trends happen in order to try to move things forward. And a lot of it is businesses will just say, you know what, we're producing disc brakes on all of our bikes. And then that kind of forces a change in the consumers that goes back to the. So growth is seen as a necessity in this system. This change is necessary. And natural resources viewed as merely factors of production rather than critical supply materials, services, or waste sinks. We have to mine or acquire the materials needed to produce these. And those are just factors in the production. It's kind of like if you're trying to build something and you need 10 of product A, 2 of product B, and 1 of product C, if you only have 39 of each of the products, then product A is going to be your limiting resource in that supply chain. So, looking at ecological economics, this acknowledges dependence on essential life support services provided by nature, water, air, all that other stuff. Regards some aspects of nature as irreplaceable and essential. So, looking at the Flint, Michigan accident, that kind of really brought it into light that water is this essential thing that's needed, this essential resource that's needed, and in some cases it might not be as replaceable as previously thought. Principles concerned its equitable distribution of resources and rights. And the steady state economy is characterized by low human birth and death rates, use of renewable energy sources, material recycling, and emphasis on efficiency and stability. And when you talk a little bit about the environment, a lot of times we're not talking about hard goods. We're not talking about purchasing, something that's made out of wood or something that's made out of metal or anything like that. A lot of times we're talking about aesthetic value. There's a reason why we have natural or national parks, is because if you look out onto national parks, some people just want to go there for how it looks. When I was at University of South Dakota, I took I went on spring break to Colorado, and my wife and I went into the Rocky Mountains. And the reason that we really enjoyed kind of being out there is just the aesthetics of being up in the mountains, seeing everything. And so that is irreplaceable, because if those aesthetics are gone, then there's no reason for people to kind of visit that area if the natural resources are removed. Looking at resource, capital, and reserve. So with the different types of resources, capital is any form of wealth available to use more wealth. Money is technically, depends on the situation, but like dollars are not considered to be part of capital because they don't actually produce more wealth, while like stocks are considered to be capital because they do produce more wealth. Now, at the same time, you have to use money in order to, like dollars, in order to purchase stocks. So therefore, they can be viewed as a form of capital. But from everything that I've kind of heard, that most of the time when measuring resources, capital, you don't consider, or cash on hand is kind of the last thing that's considered when coming up with capital. So this capital can be natural, it can be human or cultural, it can be manufactured, it can be social. So a resource is anything with potential use in creating wealth or giving satisfaction. Now, notice that giving satisfaction, meaning that entertainment is considered to be a resource. So non-renewable resources are materials present in fixed amounts in the environment. So this is where you come across a lot of stuff like precious metals. We cannot make gold and platinum in massive quantities to meet kind of demand. So what's out in nature is what is out in nature. We cannot recreate that. Renewable resources are materials that can be replenished or replaced. So wood, for example, is a renewable resource because cut down a tree and plant a replacement, then we can come back in a period of time and there will be more wood available for harvest. And then there's intangible resources. These are what I talked about before with aesthetics. So open space, beauty, serenity, things like that. So the aesthetic value, going to a park, that's an intangible resource, right? Having that ability to go to a park and enjoy everything in that. Uh, the River Greenway here in town is an intangible resource because a lot of times we use that for, I use it for running, you can use it for transportation, and those things are intangible, right? There's sort of, that's the pleasure aspect. So proven reserves, they've been thoroughly mapped and are economical to recover at current prices with available technology. If you want a really good example of this, look at Economics Explained YouTube channel. They just did a video over negative resources, and they were talking mostly about oil. And negative resources are things where companies pay you to take their product. And an example of that is trash. Like we pay people to take away our trash. Is trash a resource? That's debatable. But if you have a box sitting in your house, that box is a resource that you could use, but you still pay someone to take it away and recycle it for you. Known reserves have been located but are not completely mapped. So, for example, looking for oil wells, there are oil wells that exist that are not completely mapped. Therefore, is it worth actually going out and setting up in order to try to remove that resource? And then there's undiscovered reserves. These are speculative or inferred. Like, we know that they're out there, we just don't know where they're at. We know that once we say that we've mined all of the gold in the world, that there's possibly still more gold out there that we just have not found. And then recoverable reserves are assets with are accessible with current technology, but are not necessarily economical. As in, we can get to it, but it might be a waste of time and money in order to do that. And there's so for example, right now, when we had talked about oil is kind of at a negative price right now per barrel. Therefore, spending a lot of money on looking for new wells and putting like offshore oil rigs, which are very expensive, putting offshore oil rigs out there in order to mine those might not necessarily be the most economical thing given the current prices. In the future, though, it may be a little more economical to do that. So here's kind of the flow chart of how you look at that. So on the y-axis, you have degree of economical feasibility with low to high, and then on the x-axis, you have an inverse, so it's high on the left and low on the right with degree of geological assurance. So these non-recoverable resources present in the earth but not obtainable, these are not economically feasible. We might be able to get to them, but it would take so much time, effort, money, all of that, that it's just not worth it. Then we have recoverable resources. These are not likely to make a profit. So for the most part, they're pretty low on this economic feasibility scale. Known resources, these are where we know where they're at, but we don't know how much is there. It's kind of like if you see a stack of money and there's a 20 on top, it could be all ones underneath. So we haven't measured how much is there, but we know that it's there. Then you have proven reserves, which are what we know of, we know how much is there, and then discovered reserves being very similar. Then you kind of go into these speculative and undiscovered resources. And so you have this potential economic threshold, right? So here's your technological threshold, right? This is where everything below this we just can't get to. In this area, we can get to it, but is it really worth the money? And then above this is your potential economic threshold. These most likely are not going to be used. These will be used. So communal property resources, everybody's favorite thing right here. As I say sarcastically, Garrett Hardin had talked about Tragedy of the Commons. If you want a really good movie about what commons are and things like that, there's a movie called The Gods Must Be Crazy. And it's about a bottle which falls into a tribe in the middle of nowhere. And this is instantly an item that is not held in common, as in not everyone owns it because it's limited. So that's what a common means. A common is something that we all enjoy. So for example, a park that's free. That is a common. We can all go there and enjoy the value of the park. So commonly held resources are inevitably degraded because self-interest of public individuals tends to outweigh public interest. This is a very nice way of saying that people are going to exploit a resource in order to benefit themselves over everybody else. If a piece of property gets opened up that has 1,000 trees on it, and anyone can go in there and remove trees, you might need to go in and remove a tree in order to build a table or a chair or something. We all know that there's going to be some guy that rolls up in there with massive machinery and takes everything just so that he can have it and sell it at a value. So his self-interest will outweigh everybody else. It's theorized each individual will attempt to maximize personal gain. Hardin was describing open access systems with no rules to manage resource use. All right. So this is a park opens up that has a bunch of trees in it. Have fun. Take what you need. And there's no rules. There's no restrictions. There's no regulation. You can do whatever. You can go in there with a hand axe. You can go in there with massive equipment. Doesn't matter. Have at it. And so these systems don't exist. Like, we think of these systems as not existing within like the US and things like that. There are tight regulations on a lot of places like this, but this still does exist in the world where there are people that are going to exploit certain things. So the big example that comes to mind is conflict diamonds or blood diamonds in Africa, where people go in there, they exploit the local population, they exploit these mines and things like that in order to maximize profit and self-interest for themselves. So population, technology, and scarcity. So many economists contend neither supply or demand relationships nor economical recoverable reserves are rigidly fixed. Human ingenuity and enterprise often allows us to respond to scarcity in ways that postpone or alleviate predicted effects. Take a look at our school district. We have now switched online. Why? Because we have to. And our ingenuity and all of these things have led to us switching to different platforms. I use YouTube and Google Meets. Other teachers use Zoom. There's all of these different things that we can utilize in order to kind of overcome this. And the exact same thing. So if we start to hit the end of the life cycle of an item, or the demand or the supply becomes scarce, we can find ways to overcome that. So right now, the one that gets brought up quite a bit is vehicles, right? We use oil for a lot of stuff, but if I said oil, the first thing that you go to is cars, gas, and the oil that goes in. But plastics, so the plastic that makes up my keyboard and my mouse, plastics that make up parts of my phone and the camera that I use, light that I use, and microphone that I'm talking through, and all of that stuff are made from types of oils that are refined in different ways. So if we kind of spread this really thin, right? If we kind of spread this thin in looking at we have to use it for plastics, but then we also have to use it in vehicles. We have to use it for fuel and cars. Well, what happens when the reserves start to run low? And that's sort of where the electric car has emerged, because now you've produced this thing that it can run off of any type of energy that goes into it. So if you wanted to, you could fire up a diesel generator and charge your electric car, or you could plug it into solar. And so it leads to this kind of widespread use of this new resource that has been kind of utilized because of the scarcity or the impending scarcity of another resource. So market efficiencies and technological development. Increasing technology efficiency can alter supply and demand. So we know this quite a bit. I mean, look at how certain vehicles or cars have progressed over time. So as technology makes goods and services cheaper, the quantity available at a given price can increase. This is basically the entire economic go of a lot of cheap Chinese products, right? You produce these goods and services at a very, very low cost. You're able to make a lot of them, and you're able to sell them at a competitive price. As materials become more expensive and difficult to obtain, it becomes more cost effective to discover new supplies or use existing supplies more efficiently. This is kind of a way of saying, like, once things start to become scarce, once resources and materials start to become scarce, then you have to find a way to move to other items. There's a reason that a lot of higher end watches tend to be made out of metal, lower end watches tend to be made out of plastics. A lot of it has to do with the cost effectiveness of supplies. It's not that, a lot of metals are expensive or difficult to maintain, but the refinement process behind that is difficult and expensive, and so a lot of companies forego that because plastics is cheap and easy to work with. So scarcity and development. So start with a spot. Let's start at the top. New resources are created. And because these new resources are created, and created in quotes here because it might just be discovered, and so prices fall and demand rises, easily accessible reserves are exhausted. This leads to scarcity of resources, which then results in increasing prices. But then again, once prices go up, people are going to find a way to do it better. So it's going to stimulate research and development, lead into new technologies that are going to lead to substitution, reuse, and recycling of those materials back into these new are created. The thing that I think of the most with this, I'm into amateur radio. And with amateur radio, everybody kind of thinks of the big three Japanese manufacturers. Yaesu, ICOM, and Kenwood are the three big Japanese radio manufacturers. For the cheapest Yaesu radio, it's $70. For the cheapest radio, you can get one called a Baofeng for $30. They're very, very low quality. But the thing is that if you just want to get into that hobby, that's a way you can do it, is with these inexpensive radios. And because of that, it's kind of created this shift in the radio market where people have started to started to find ways to cut costs on these higher end Japanese radios. So can we make the radios out of more plastics? Can we have a new development technique? Can we skimp out on what we put into it in order to make it more cost effective? So increasing environmental carrying capacity. So technological developments have resulted in price decreases for raw materials over the last 100 years. A lot of this just has to do with the increase of the assembly line, mass manufacturing, and our ability to extract resources. So economists generally believe this pattern will continue, while ecologists generally disagree. There is a limiting point. Myself being an ecologist, the reason that I somewhat disagree with this is because there is a point where you can only extract so much, even as technology increases. It's not a pure exponential curve. Let's say that right now we can extract, hypothetically, 10 trees per day. We can extract and turn it into a product that is ready to be sold to a manufacturer to turn it into a good table, a chair, anything like that. There hits a point where, okay, as technology increases, we might be able to extract 20 trees a day, but there probably won't be a point where we're literally extracting 5 million trees in one day with one company, right? Or we're going to be extracting billions, and there just hits a point where the technology is limited and it just can't physically be done. That is where my disagreement is with it. But I think that as technology does increase, and price decreases, that's going to continue on. Again, back to what I know, looking at wristwatches. The most expensive watches sold are either one-offs, as in they're only made one time, or they were owned by someone who's very established, or it defined something. Right? The most expensive wristwatch sold recently was a Patek Philippe. There's only one of that. A guy paid $32 million for it, and he's the only guy in the world that owns this one watch. And so that makes it valuable. And there's nothing special. It's stainless steel. It's made out of regular things, but the cost of a lot of like precious metal watches has started to decrease. For instance, gold. Gold watch prices have decreased it because the ability to extract and refine and manufacture those has decreased. There's also the ability to make something gold that's not just yellow. You can now make rose gold and things like that. And because this technology has changed, it's led to more desirability, and it's led to this kind of decrease in order to meet that demand. So natural resource accounting. Gross national product, or GNP, it's the total value of goods and services provided by an economy in 1 year. Gross domestic product, or GDP, only includes activities within national boundaries. Both are criticized as measures of well-being, and they do not necessarily distinguish between beneficial and harmful growth. So when you look at GDP, China has a very high GDP, but we all know about their human rights violations and things like that. And so when we look at GDP, look at it as, wow, it must be really good to live in this place. Looking at the GDP of the US, tends to do pretty well for itself. So we think of it as, it's a pretty good place to live, and then we kind of associate that with other. But we're not looking at how might that be, is it beneficial? Could it be harmful? Looking at blood diamonds, yes, that does bring money into the local economy, but there's a reason that they're called conflict or blood diamonds. Also do not account resource depletion or ecosystem damage. What happens when that mine is completely stripped of all the diamonds? What's going to happen with all of those people that live there? And a lot of this is not brought up. A really good example that you can see with this is Detroit. The auto industry collapsed, and look what happened to Detroit. You can go up there and buy houses for less than $100. So alternatives to GNP and GDP is the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare. This takes into account real per capita income, distribution, equity, natural resource depletion, and environmental damages. So this takes into account a lot of those factors that will say, like, is this long-term wealth, or is this just very temporary? It looks good on paper, and then in a couple years work. Human Development Index. This is kind of my go-to, is Human Development Index. There are some flaws with it, but I think for the most part, it's pretty good. Incorporates life expectancy, educational attainment, and standard of living measures. So looking at this, if you look at a country, like if you look at the US, life expectancy is pretty good. Educational attainment, like looking at myself, how I said I should not have went to college because my parents failed to complete high school. So that educational attainment, being able to go up to a master's and work on a PhD and things like that, that says a lot about human development, while in some places that is not necessarily the case. And standard of living measures. A lot of Americans, even in the lower percentages of the economic range, still live pretty well. Like when I talk about last time when we talked about human ecology, one of the things that I didn't mention is that, if in some parts of the world, like if I gave you that $100 a month, you would be earning $1,200 a year, $1,200 a year. And that's more than a lot of people in some countries earn in a year. It's more than they earn in 10 years. So it's, there are countries where people earn less than $600 per year. And so thinking about what that standard of living is like, and I know there's an argument about like, well, they don't know any better and things like that. Like I enjoy playing video games all the time. And it's one of those things that if no one in those places had ever played video games, are they really losing out on much? I enjoy, going on a bike ride, and if they don't have bikes, is that something that they've really missed out on? And then there's the Gender Development Index. This is where it's adjusted for inequality between genders. This tends to be a really good factor of telling where a country sits at in their economic development, because like I said last time, the role of women in society does kind of play into the amount of children that households will have, and different developments like that. Like if a mother's place, or if a female's place is to raise children compared to getting a job and establishing a career for themselves, then those two individuals will have a different outcome in life and therefore contribute differently to a country if that tends to be the standard. The most recent standard is if you look at population growth in Saudi Arabia going into the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there tends to be a pretty big fluctuation because a lot happened in that time frame. So that's a really good case study to look at. Looking at adjusted inflation, so looking at gross national product in red and per capita index of sustainable welfare, years on the x-axis increasing, and on the y-axis you have inflation adjusted in dollars to 1972, increasing as the axis increases. So you could see that per capita gross national product has increased while sustainable or your ISW has increased slightly, but it tends to be pretty stable. And there's a lot of factors into that. A lot of things can kind of factor into that. I would explain it a little more, but I'm running out of time. So cost benefit analysis. This is something that we do all the time. We as in people, we do it all the time when it comes to a lot of stuff. This is an attempts to assign values to resources and social and environmental effects of carrying out any. Right, we look at what is the benefit for me of doing this? Is this worth, it can be worth my time, my money, whatever it is. So it tries to optimize efficiency, tries to find an optimal efficiency point at which the marginal cost of pollution control equals marginal benefit. Looking at this from an environmental standpoint, there are companies out there that will break laws because they know that the fine is less than the profit that they'll make. So they make, let's say if they follow the rules, they'll make $100,000 of profit. If they break the rule, they'll make $500,000 of profit, but they'll only get fined $300,000, which means they made in the end $200,000 of profit. And so there's a lot of companies that look at these cost benefit analysis like, what should we do? Criticisms include absence of standards, inadequate attention to alternatives, and placing monetary values. Wow. Literally the fattest squirrel in the world jumped up on my windowsill. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Criticisms include absence of standards, inadequate attention to alternatives, and placing monetary values on intangible costs and benefit. Okay, so I have all of this trash. What do I do with it? How do I dispose of my waste? If you're telling me that I just can't dump it into the river, but you haven't provided me with an alternative means to dispose of it, then what do we do? And right now, the big thing with this is a lot of industrial pollution. Like, okay, my foundry produces a ton of CO2, but what's the alternative? What other choice do I have? I mean, if you gave me the option of, we'll lease you the land next to your factory in order to produce solar energy for it at a lower cost, okay, that's providing an alternative. But if you're just going to say, no, you can't do this because it's bad for the environment, okay, well, what's another alternative? I had a sergeant major in the Marines when I was in the Navy who used to always say, it's really easy to spot problems. It's very difficult to identify a solution or to present a solution. And so that's kind of the way I go into it. Like, you've identified a lot of these problems, but let's develop a solution. That's the more important part. Market-based environmental production. So pollution charges, you've probably also heard this referred to as a carbon tax. This is where fees assessed per unit of effluent being waste, encourages businesses to perform as much pollution control as possible. So pollution charges sounds a little bit better. It's a little bit more politically correct. Carbon tax makes it sound like it's a tax, and no one likes taxes. Tradable permits, you probably heard this called cap and trade. This allows companies or notions to reduce pollution below target levels and to sell their excess capacity. Let's say both you and I own a business. We're allowed to release 100 tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. I release 70 tons this year, so I sell you my extra 30. So discount rates, economic methods of using a time factor into accounting, recognizes that something may be worth more today than it will be in the future. Hence, has oil production decreased? No, oil production is not decreased. We're just now paying companies to store it in ships offshore for when it does become more valuable in the future, and then they can sell it, make a profit. Choice of discount rates is problematic with intangible resources and long time frames. If there's so building a greenway in town, we build that hoping that over time people will utilize it, but it's hard to measure that. It's hard to put a dollar sign on what looks. In the future, a business might be constructed, and that will change how people view that greenway if that business intrudes on. So internal versus external costs. Internal costs are expensive bore by using a resource, while external costs are from someone other than those using a resource. So for example, harvesting of diamonds, right? So the internal cost is, okay, I have to pay to extract these diamonds. The external cost is that this is money injected into the area. Therefore, the amount of violence in the area increases because everyone wants a cut of that profit. So that would be internal versus external cost. Internal cost, I need to extract all these trees. I need to harvest this forest. External cost, we've destroyed the aesthetic value of this area and decreased the amount of oxygen. So internalized costs, ensuring those that reap the benefits of the resources also bear all the external costs. This is difficult to do. It kind of treads a little bit on the moral economy. So trade development, according to economic theory and comparative advantage, each place has goods or services that it can supply in better quantity or at better prices than this keeps low developed countries in a perpetual role of resource suppliers to more developed countries. It's kind of that whole thing like we don't make anything in the U.S. anymore. Well, yeah, because we have places that can make it for us cheaper, and that kind of keeps them in this cycle of you're going to continue to produce low cost stuff for us. So green businesses. During the Industrial Revolution, raw materials were seen as inexhaustible. Going back to resource extraction, it was very difficult for us to extract resources at that time. And every time you went in, you were able to extract more resources. You know, it's like if you have the ability to only cut one tree per day, a forest is going to seem like you will never get to the end of it. So many trees. Recently, many businesses have realized that this is flawed, that there is a finite amount of resources that are out there. Operating in a socially responsible manner, this with principles of sustainable business and can be good for business. Is it in my interest to cut down every tree and sell them right away? Maybe, but probably not. You know, for the most part, it might be good to kind of come up with this way to go through and produce a lot of this stuff. Look at crop rotation with farmers. You know, farmers rotate between corn and soybeans because they know that soybean helps the soil. Soybeans add nutrients back into the soil, and therefore it saves them money. So is that good for business? Well, yeah. I mean, saving money. If you know your company made, if you're a farmer and you made $500,000 without crop rotation, and then you $550,000 with crop rotation, then you've just made $50,000 of profit. That's never a bad thing. So pollution is waste and is lower profits. You have to find a way to dispose of that waste. Look at nuclear power plants. Nuclear power plants have to find a way to dispose of their waste. The huge cost that they have to entail. Then jobs in the environment. So for years, business leaders portrayed environmental protection and jobs as mutually exclusive. But Ecological Anonymous found only 0.1% of a large-scale layoff in the U.S. recently was government regulations. So that is a very small amount. Recycling requires more labor than use of virgin resources. Use of new. So this is why I've said the cost of precious metal watches started to decrease, because now start to recycle a lot of the material in that. It is very, very common that if you send in a precious metal watch or precious metal jewelry for servicing and polish it, polishing does remove a small layer of metal. They keep that metal. they will use that to make more product with, because that is saving them money. Yes, in the end, you have to create a job, some guy that has to be able to extract all of that from the materials and fine it and clean it back up and produce a new product with it. Right now, the big thing is development of batteries. So what we switch over to green energy. The last time I checked, solar panels don't work that well at night. Now, I haven't checked in a couple days and might have changed, but solar panels don't really work well at night. Therefore, if you want to have solar panels, you need an effective way in order to store that energy for use at night. And there's a lot of technology that's going into this. The number one storage mean is batteries. There's also other things like pumping water up to the top of a hill, and then at night we let the water drain back down and power hydroelectric generators. And building that stuff, building that equipment, and just coming up with that technology in general requires jobs, and it requires people to work at it. It's not the most glamorous job in the entire world, but it's, they're still being productive members of society. So to kind of summarize everything we went through, with the economic worldviews, we went through classic, neoclassic, and logical economics. Talked about resources, capital, and reserves, population, technology, and scarcity, natural resource accounting, trade development, and green businesses. The last thing I wanted to kind of emphasize on, I know I have like a minute left. Last thing I wanted to emphasize on with green, like right now, it's really cool to be environmentally friendly. Really cool to be environmentally friendly. It's this thing that's happening where, it's cool to own a Tesla. And because this has kind of made its way into trends, it's kind of changed how a lot of people view green businesses. Having solar is cool. It's marketable, PR thing. So green business has really grown because of all of that. But that is all I have for today. I'm sorry it took me a really long time to kind of get through this. I will be moving over to in a minute. I might be a couple minutes late. I'm going to run and use the bathroom really quick. But I will see everybody over minutes watching.